Hello, my name's Heather and welcome to my channel, or welcome back to my channel. And I make videos mostly about UK politics from a left-wing perspective. I make quite a lot about the Labour Party, but maybe it's a sign of maturity that I'm moving on from that, and this one is going to be about something very different. It's going to be about the current inquiry that's going on, public inquiry into undercover policing. It's a really, really important inquiry from lots of perspectives to understand the way in which state power works, impacts the lives of so many people, the way in which policing works. And it's got relatively little coverage. There are some amazing work by activists to bring this to public attention, and by some journalists as well. And so I'm going to mention Tom Fowler, who's an activist who does the Spy Cops Info podcast and related social media. And I will put links to that in the description below this video, and also to the activist group Police Spies Out of Lives, who's made up of some of the women who were deceived into sexual relationships by undercover officers who were spying on them. And this video is just going to be about one very small aspect of the inquiry, and hopefully I'll make more, particularly if people are interested. So please indicate by liking this video or commenting if this is something you want more of. And it's going to be about the witness who gave evidence today. So this is Tuesday the 22nd of October, and the witness's name is Kaden Blake. And she gave evidence about the way in which her brother's identity was stolen as the cover ID of an undercover officer, and the impact that that's had. So if you want to get straight onto her evidence, I will put timestamps on this video so you can scroll along, or you can look below and click. But I'm going to give a little bit of background for people who don't know much about this inquiry before I come on to Kaden's really, really powerful and moving evidence. So undercover policing started, the stuff which is covered in this inquiry started in 1968. They started going undercover into mainly activist groups. There are a few right-wing groups infiltrated, but over 1,000 left-wing groups. We don't even know how many because they haven't told us how many, even though it's a public inquiry. There were over 100 officers. Again, we don't know how many because we don't know all of the officers. And it went on for decades. They had very many sexual relationships with women, many of them long-term, and some had children. They invaded people's privacy routinely. They lied about the movements on which they were spying and the people on which they were spying, and they did huge damage to the movements and to the people. They committed crimes while they were undercover. They lied to the courts because they would give testimony and they'd stand trial under the fake names. And they actually did something which is really horrendous. So routinely, they would take the confidential, privileged legal advice that activists were getting to defend themselves against the police after they'd been arrested, and they would feed that straight back to the police. For most of the period while they were undercover police officers operating, they did this practice of taking the names of dead children. And that's what I'm going to come on to. But first, I want to say something about how to, if you are interested in this, how to engage further. And I'm going to put some links below to follow up, how to get into learning more about the inquiry and listening to and watching the evidence. Initially, it feels really difficult to understand. There's a lot of jargon, so you'll routinely hear things like T2P1, TBS, HM109, Category F core participants, the SDS Tradecraft manual, the non-state participants, the MPOIU, so much jargon. There's also a lot of detail, like trying to work out who's who and what happened when, and get that kind of overarching, framework within which each individual witness can fit, because although it's roughly chronological, the evidence is not precisely chronological, and there's a lot of overlapping issues in terms of who did what when and how things worked. There's also a lot of really, really deep issues that took a while for me to understand, or begin to understand, because I still don't fully understand them. The role of secrecy during the undercover operations, and now the police rationale for undercover policing, and what that means now, how that's being tested out through this inquiry, and the role of management. who knew what about what was going on. But I would say, just don't worry about all of this. The live evidence is surprisingly accessible, I think, because you get a witness for maybe 2 hours, or sometimes even longer, and you find out if they're an activist, you find out about their history, about their experiences, about the impact on them of being spied on. If they're a police officer, you get to understand how they make sense of what they did, the kind of excuses they come up with, when they're willing to concede, which is very rare, they did anything wrong, the kind of entitlement they operate with, the arrogance, and so on. It's so on a human level, there's so much that you can learn from this. And on an activist level, there's so much you can learn as well about, as I said, about how state power operates and the impunity that the police have. And I think it gives a real perspective on what's happening now with the crackdown on activism. I would, as I said, recommend, alongside watching the live evidence, also looking at the information put out by activists like Tom Fowler, his Spy Cops Info podcast, and also 2 really useful books I found were Undercover by the journalists Rob Evans and Paul Lewis, and Deep Deception, which is by activists Helen Steele and other of the women who not only were raped by these officers with the authority of the state, deceived into sexual relationships, but also in a lot of cases did the hard work, investigative work, to find out who these police officers were. And it's because of them that we have this public inquiry. So I think it's really important to know more about what they brought to it and to acknowledge our debt to them. I think the public inquiry, despite being a public inquiry, does not do its best to make the evidence accessible. The website's quite difficult, the videos aren't edited and aren't very well annotated. So I hope that this video makes it a little bit more accessible. So, the issue of stolen dead children's identities. This was done because the police worried that these officers would go into a group, they'd come out of nowhere, they'd stick around for 4 years, they'd disappear, they'd not have any family links, they'd maybe be a little bit suspicious, and the activists would cotton on, or at least think something was wrong here. And they would then go to look for a birth certificate to see if this was a real person. And the police thought, well, if they find a real birth certificate, then, correct date of birth, correct name, correct place of birth, then that will put people off. That would make activists think, oh, this is a real person, this isn't a spy, so we'll just carry on as normal. And there were a lot of families who were affected, obviously, by this, because the vast majority of the officers who went undercover, this was the technique that was used. And most of the evidence we've got from the families affected is written statements. That's what I've seen so far. And some of those are very moving. But this is the first time today when I've seen oral evidence by someone from one of the families who was affected by this. And yeah, it's really impactful. Like you really feel the effect that has had, the lasting effect that's had on her and her brothers. So even though this is very, very powerful, the oral testimony, I will mention one other written statement that was submitted that's read out into evidence, and that is worth listening to, which is by Marva Lewis. And she's talking about the stealing of her brother's identity by Trevor Morris, who is an undercover officer. That's his real name, not his cover ID. And she says of his use of her dead brother's identity that it feels to her and her family like he'd stolen the identity of a deceased young black boy, and his work undercover contributed to undermining the investigation into the murder of another black boy, Stephen Lawrence. And she thinks that Trevor Morris, knew that the identity he was stealing was of a black boy because he died of sickle cell anemia. And this query is full of ironies like this, of painful, horrible ironies like this, of the use of a stolen identity of a black boy to provide cover for an officer who was working against anti-racist groups, against racial justice campaigns. Okay, so Kaden Blake, her brother is Matthew Rayner, and he died of leukemia. She has two brothers who are still living. And so what I've done with the evidence she gives is to extract and edit together 7 clips. I'm going to talk through those clips now, and then you'll see them. And I'll use captions on the screen to remind you as you're watching what each clip is about. So her testimony is given in her home. So she's zooming into the public inquiry space, and the person who's questioning her is questioning her on behalf of the inquiry, and is in that space in London. And she's sat there with her partner who's offering support. And she begins by being asked about and speaking about her memories of her brother Matthew, what happened in terms of his illness with leukemia and his death, the impact of that on her whole family, her father, mother, herself, and her 2 brothers. And then she gets asked about how she found out. So when she was contacted by someone from the inquiry 6.5 years ago. And so the first clip is about that and how she felt. The second clip is when she's asked about the witness statement provided by HN1. HN1 is the officer who took the identity Matthew Rayner. So that's his cover identity. We don't know his real name. We're not allowed to. He's got, there's a lot of secrecy here. A lot of the police are being protected. But he provided a witness statement where he explains about the process by which he decided to take the name Matthew Rayner. And we get that read out to her, and then she's asked for her reaction. Then we have some evidence which was a kind of newsletter, I guess, or an information sheet that was put together by the activists who found out that Matthew Rayner wasn't who he claimed to be, that he was a spy. And among that, they talk about him celebrating his birthday. But of course, he wasn't celebrating his birthday. He was celebrating Matthew Rayner's birthday. And we get Matthew Rayner's sister, Kaden Blake's reaction to that. The fourth clip is about his arrest. The undercover police officer was arrested while he was undercover in the animal rights movement. Again, we're going to get Kaden Blake's reaction to that. It's worth saying something about how arrest operated in undercover policing. So it was seen really positively by management that you got arrested because it provided kind of greater credibility, more legitimacy within the movement. Because these police, they were coming in out of nowhere, they were disappearing into nowhere at the end, and they didn't have any family because, of course, their real family had to be hidden because they were the police officer's family. So they were often, obviously, people who were suspicious of them or likely to get suspicious of them. And so by getting arrested, you built your credibility because, like, really would an undercover police officer get arrested? Another thing to say about his arrest, which is talked about, but I haven't got that in the clip, is that he was arrested in North Yorkshire, which is actually where Kaden and Matthew's mother was living at the time. So there's a real risk that she could have found out. Then you get the information being stated to Kaden Blake about the fact that he had a long-term relationship with one of the women on whom he was spying, a sexual relationship, and getting her reaction to that. There are 2 more clips. So one is taking an extract from actually that she wrote into her witness statement, into Kaden Blake's witness statement, but it's actually a quotation from something called the Tradecraft manual. So the Tradecraft manual was something which, after someone had stopped being an undercover officer, his time in the field was over, he was asked to write a guide for people who are going to do that kind of work. This is a really disgusting document. She talks about it as callous. You'll hear some of that language. For example, the word wearies. Wearies is the word that is used by undercover officers to describe the activists on whom they were spying. So it's very dismissive, very derogatory. But beyond that, the way they talk about the children, they call them unfortunates. And they also say that once they've decided on an identity, that they had squatters' rights to it. So that means they didn't simply take on the name. They would get identification in that name, driver's licenses, passport, whatever, that they would also use aspects of their life. So where they were born will be part of the cover ID, the legend, and so on. So yes, squatters' rights. Finally, what I show is the person speaking for the inquiry reading out the apology that the police have given to all of those relatives of children whose identity was stolen by police officers. Then you get Kaden Blake's really very powerful reaction to that. So over to Kaden now, and I guess I should say just thank her for giving the evidence. I think it must have been incredibly painful. It looks incredibly painful to do that. I hope she's did that because she wanted people to see it. So I hope this video is something that she feels is in line with what she's trying to do through being part of this public inquiry, through not just giving a witness statement, but giving oral evidence. And I want to say we owe her a huge debt for doing that. We owe everyone who's been part of getting this inquiry together and giving evidence to it and working for transparency and justice over this, a huge debt. So thank you to all of them.
First of all, I want to talk to you about how you came to know that this had happened. Do you remember when it was that you first found out that Matthew's identity had been used by an undercover police officer?
Yes, it was between 6.5 years ago, I believe. And there was an official gentleman at my door who told me. Sorry.
No, you go on.
Well, I remember listening to it and thinking, sort of listening to it, it was difficult to process, and it felt unreal. I didn't know what reaction to give. I'd never heard anything like this before. I didn't, I know it's not something you expect to hear, somebody turning up on your doorstep and giving you this information. Really, really surreal it was. Yeah, and then I didn't have to, but I informed one of my brothers, who then informed my other brother, which was quite difficult because I had to pass on that information myself.
I'm asked why I chose the identity of a particular deceased child. It is because this identity met the criteria in the guidance. And then we have a gist. HM1 discusses the process of identifying the cover identity he would use throughout his SDS employment. I think I returned from the registry with a few options, which I would have shared with SDS managers. The other options were eliminated by the office as being for some reason unsuitable. And it is for this reason that I came to use Matthew Edward Rayner's name as part of my cover identity. This deceased child was born in Sheffield. I went there for a day, but it was part of my backstory that I had moved from Sheffield whilst still very young, so I did not remember the city. Miss Blake, how does it make you feel reading about how HM1 came to choose Matthew's identity and use it as his own?
Emotionally sick, really. And my parents were easily traceable, so I don't understand that part of it. Morally outraged that they had to go to such lengths and not just make up false identity.
This article presents what the authors had discovered about the officer using your brother's name in the course of their research. I just want to highlight the very first two lines at the top of the page. It says of HM1, he always celebrated his birthday, often at the famous Three Kings pub in the Fulham, West Kensington area, and as a result, his date of birth was known. This would later prove important in confirming that he had used a false identity. Miss Blake, do you have any particular thoughts about HM1 using Matthew's birth date and celebrating his birthday?
Yes, it's very, very unpleasant that he was I'm assuming over a number of years, celebrating birth of what my brother, who was dead, and he should have been celebrating himself, whereas somebody who'd assumed his name was celebrating in his stead. And it feels so wrong. So it should have been a family occasion for the real family, not for somebody pretending to be him.
So, Miss Blake, this document is entitled Branch Note, Arrest of SDS Undercover Officer DSHN1. And this would have been an internal note written by a manager, which relates to the arrest of HN1. But I was going to read the top part of the document. On Saturday, the 12th of August 1995, HN1 was arrested and charged with a public order offence while on duty, taking part in disruption of a grouse shoot in North Yorkshire. At no time was his role as an undercover police officer revealed or compromised. He was charged at Northallerton Police Station as follows. On Saturday, the 12th of August 1995, at Stang Forest, used threatening, abusive or insulting words or behaviour or disorderly behaviour within the hearing or sight of a person likely to be caused harassment, alarm or distress, thereby contrary to Section 5.1 of the Public Order Act 1986. And he was bailed to appear at a magistrate's court around a month later. And there's a note there that the offence, if convicted, carries a maximum penalty of a fine. What impact does it have on you knowing that HN1 was arrested and charged with a criminal offence in your brother's name?
That's horrible, disgusting, and I don't know what press was given at the time to that, but I'm assuming the name could have been mentioned in or on the press, and although there will be other people with that name, it's horrible to think of that name being associated with being arrested. And also this person, I assume, didn't have the views of the groups that he had infiltrated, so for totally false reasons.
As you are aware, Miss Blake, and you've referred to into your witness statement, HN1 entered into a relationship with a woman, Denise Fuller, whilst he was undercover, and throughout this time he was reporting on Miss Fuller. Is there anything you'd like to say about your reaction when you found this out and the impact it's had on your memory of your brother?
Yeah, it's, again, another sullying of my brother's name. When I realised that that sort of thing had been going on, I felt extreme sympathy for the ladies involved, being duped into relationships, and somebody believing that somebody with my brother's name again, the only person who should have had my brother's name was my brother, and not somebody pretending to be him and carrying out actions that I'm practically sure he wouldn't have as a real person, as a living adult. So it's doubly painful that he, did what he did, but also duped, that women would well, they were duped and in my brother's name. But it's very, very surreal thing to think about, actually. Because if my brother lived, he should have had a proper relationship with somebody. I'd have had nephews and nieces, hopefully, and a sister-in-law. But that was obviously never to be. Matthew never got the chance of that.
So you refer to this document MPS 052757 entitled Special Demonstration Squad Tradecraft Manual. And I'm just going to read the bit that you have reproduced in your statement. By tradition, the aspiring SDS officer's first major task on joining the back office was to spend hours and hours at St Catherine's House, leafing through death registers in search of a name he could call his own. On finding a suitable ex-person, usually a deceased child or young person with a fairly anonymous name, the circumstances of his or her untimely demise was investigated. If the death was natural or otherwise unspectacular, and therefore unlikely to be findable in newspapers or other public records, the SDS officer would apply for a copy of the dead person's birth certificate. Further research would follow to establish the respiratory status of the dead person's family, if any, and, if they were still breathing, where they were living. If all was suitably obscure and there was little chance of the SDS officer, or more importantly, one of the wearies running into the dead person's parents or siblings, etc., the SDS officer would assume squatter's rights over the unfortunate's identity for the next 4 years. And I should just be clear that that emphasis added is, of course, your own. Miss Blake, it might be difficult to say, but can you tell us how you felt when you read this document?
Well, like my brother's memory was abused and all our grieving meant for nothing. And some of the words used are extremely callous, I think. And the thought that they went, they looked at so many death certificates of children, did it not tweak any emotions in them of what they were doing, that they were looking at people's utter grief and that didn't matter? Because although these children are dead, they've had such impact on the relatives remaining, that doesn't go away. It affects the rest of your life. Your behaviour, your self-worth, everything it affects. And it just sounds such a callous way of doing things. And like I've said before, for such a I'm not saying invaluable reason, but very low value reason, I think.
Miss Blake, I think in your witness statement, you say that when you were first informed about what had happened, about Matthew's identity being used by the undercover officer, you were offered a written apology from the police if you agreed to accept it. And you say in your witness statement that you did not accept it, as you felt it would not mean anything.
No.
More recently, in the opening statement to Tranche 2, Phase 1 of this inquiry, which was published in June of this year, the Metropolitan Police made the following statement. I'm going to read it. The Metropolitan Police Service accepts that the managers of the SDS failed to recognise the hurt, distress and anger that the use of deceased children's identities would cause the families of the children and the public concern that would result if the practice had been revealed. It apologises unreservedly to the families for this. It also wishes to acknowledge that their distress will have been compounded by the revelation that some SDS officers behaved indefensibly while using their children's names. How do you feel about this apology now? Do you feel any differently to how you did when you initially found out about the use of Matthew's identity?
No, I feel it's worthless, and it is only, in hindsight that they've issued it, and it was a blanket apology, I assume. It wasn't anything personally written to each person. It's like, oh, we were sorry we got found out. That's what it sounds like to me. They're human beings, surely. Oh, we didn't I assume they're saying we didn't realise the hurt that it would cause until after we were told the hurt that it caused. Any human being, surely, has compassion and has the ability to put yourself in the situation. Oh, what if that was one of my siblings that had died and that was happening to me at the time? it's a natural human thing to do. I think it's extremely callous thing not to be able to put yourself in somebody else's situation, especially grief. That's what makes us human.